welcome everyone to another episode of the FIBA on Risk and Compliance Excellence, otherwise known as the FORCE podcast. Today's topic is a very interesting one. It's called Cuellos Blancos, Manos Sucias, which means white collars, dirty hands in English. And this is actually the title of a podcast launched by the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, otherwise known as the OCCRP, which is one of the largest investigative journalism organizations in the world. And they're actually headquartered in Amsterdam, but have reporters and staff pretty much across the 6 continents, of course. I guess you don't have anybody yet in Antarctica, but that's okay. That could happen one day. So Venezuela has been in the global spotlight really since January 3rd, when U.S. forces captured Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro. However, for financial institutions, Venezuela has been on their radar thanks to the extensive sanctions program implemented by the U.S. Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC. And at the heart of this program has been PDVSA, which is the state-run oil company, and movements of funds related to PDVSA. Now, even though they've been sanctioned, creative people have developed many schemes to avoid these sanctions, and we will hear about one uncovered by the OCCRP. Very intricate, very detailed, very effective until they were caught. Here to share the story with us today are Laura Weffer, a reporter for OCCRP, and Nathan Jaccard, editor for Latin America. Both are career journalists who have received several awards for their work. They're going to relate to us, as I mentioned, a fascinating account of one of the efforts to avoid sanctions and launder billions of dollars worth of proceeds corruptly obtained from PDVSA. Laura and Nathan, thank you for joining us today. Perhaps the two of you could provide us a little background on OCCRP for our audience that may not be familiar with your group.
Hi, David. Thank you for having us today. OCCRP is a project that started nearly 18 years ago, first in Eastern Europe, and then it expanded little by little on other parts of the world. And as you said, like today, we have staff and journalists in every continent, but we also work collaboratively. This is a network, and a network where we work on organized crime and corruption stories. And we investigate. These are long-term investigations, 6 months, a year. We use also a lot of big data leaks and data sets to follow the money, basically, and to identify the schemes, but also who is behind the scheme, who is behind a shell company, for instance, and to expose them. We work on a collaborative way. In Latin America, we have worked with nearly every country, every journalist in many of the Latin American countries. Also in the US, in Europe, because as I guess many of the audience know, we money goes through all these jurisdictions. So we work together to try to have a picture as complete as possible and an investigation as complete as possible that will take us, for instance, to Panama, then to Florida, then to Spain. So that's really what we do. You can find more information, and you can check our investigation in OCCRP.org.
Great, thank you for that. And you mentioned Florida. We do have that very strong connection with Venezuela, particularly here in South Florida, in Miami. We have communities which are very heavy in a Venezuelan population. In fact, we have Doral, which we affectionately call Doralzuela here, and we have Weston, which we call Westonzuela because of the size of the Venezuelan population of expats that have come here. And so, of course, we see the headlines. We see the headlines of these corruption cases, which, of course, we see the end result, right? There is a description in the article about who the people might be that are involved, but nothing as detailed as what we're going to discuss today, which, as I said, is a fascinating but so on point story of corruption and money laundering that I know the audience will be so interested to hear. So let's start at the beginning. I listened a little bit to the podcast. I've read the articles, and really, I like the way it was framed there on your website. It all started with a recording. So maybe you can talk to us a little bit about this recording and how it came about.
Yes, David. I would love to talk about the recording, but that's part of the plot twist of the podcast. So if you really, really want to know what is it about, you have to listen to it. But going to your comment about Miami, one of the important things is about the podcast, or not the important things, but one we try to do this podcast in a way that is very relatable. So it is about corruption. It talks about a huge scheme of money laundering. It goes all over the place. I mean, from New Zealand to Venezuela. But what we really try to do is to create a story that anyone could listen and anyone could understand. And as part of that effort, we place Miami as one of the centers of money laundering, because that's the place where every Latin American community has a representation. So we even tell a little bit of story of how Miami was created, was founded, with a little bit of music. And one of the persons that we interviewed, she told us she used to be a federal attorney, I think, and now she's a lawyer of white collar criminals, and she will tell us that Miami is the hub where all these schemes happen, at least in this part of the world. So I think if we take Miami as our headquarters or base on how the whole podcast develops, I will say that is the cradle where all begins and where it all ends.
Not something that we're necessarily proud of.
No.
We have our annual anti-money laundering conference, which this year will be celebrating our 26th year. And several years ago, we had the U.S. attorney for the Southern District come and do a keynote. And he opened the keynote, because we do have a large audience from Latin America and the Caribbean, welcoming everybody to South Florida and adding, we are number one for tax fraud, for healthcare fraud. And he was naming them all. And it's true. Very creative people seem to land here. But of course, with Latin America, the key is geography and culture, right? That's really a part of what built Miami, is the Latin culture that we have. As you mentioned, we have representatives from all of the countries here, and it's more comfortable to operate here, whether that's for good or for bad. That is part of that situation. And Nathan, you were about to say something.
Yeah, complementing what Laura was saying, of course, we don't want to tell too much, but like the beginning of the podcast was really that we obtained some documents from the Spanish prosecutor office. And within all these documents, it was an investigation against several people that were laundering dirty Venezuelan funds, basically. And there was an audio recording of a meeting that took place in Madrid. Madrid is the other, we can say, Latin American capital. It's also a place where a lot of good and bad Latin Americans are investing. And basically, it's a meeting where they are figuring out how to launder several millions that are part of a bigger scheme that costs in total $1.2 billion to PDVSA, to the Venezuelan oil company. So we had like this audio, like if we were in the meeting, because one of them was wearing a mic in the meeting. And Laura was telling me, yeah, it's amazing. You have to hear this audio. We have to do a podcast because this is a material that we have rarely the opportunity to hear, really how they are planning and how it's done, basically. The behind the scenes of a major money laundering operation. So that was the point where we started, and then we pitched it, and we started like reporting and all the work behind this. We spent more than 2 years, nearly three, working on this, on the scripts, and then the production, the post-production. So yeah, but the basis was really this audio that like gave us the idea to do a podcast, basically.
So as you were saying, this basically provides a roadmap to how these proceeds of corruption were laundered. So this is one specific case, but in other investigations that maybe you've conducted, have you seen a similar roadmap or perhaps other types of roadmaps to this type of corruption?
I will say it's the same frame, it's the same pattern. What changes, and mostly, are the same names. There are these usual suspects. We have a list of names that we normally know that they might be involved, and they are related one to another. So there is like this sphere of very influential, as we call in Venezuela, enchufados. I don't know the translation, how we can translate a wire person, someone, like someone with a lot of relations within the government. So we have some names, we have that ecosystem very much identified, but what normally changes are the places where they take the money, right? And yes, they could use those tax havens, which is quite common, but they also could use places as the United States. So it's as long as the money travels long enough to be clean, that's what is really important to them. And of course, they as you mentioned, they have a lot of creativity. So they managed to invent these new ways of making the money cleaner. And what is important and interesting about this conversation that Nat was mentioning is that you could listen alive as you were sitting in front row, as you were sitting with them in the, in the meeting, all the options that the person that is creating this scheme is giving their clients in order to launder that money. So that hour of conversation is really enlightening if you are interested in this kind of topics, because you are listening. He's saying, oh, maybe we can take the money here, or maybe we can take the money there, or maybe we can issue some bonds. He's giving them options on how to launder that money. And that on itself is huge, right? Because you listen, you read about it, but you never, you listen from stories from people that has been on that places, of sources, but you have never had the chance of being there as a primary witness of how it works.
No, and I think particularly for our audience, that will be a fascinating listen, because they see the end result, right? They see the money when it comes in. They may flag something as suspicious. They'll file a suspicious activity report. And most of the time it ends there. Perhaps years, you're talking 2 years in your case, they'll see a headline in the local paper that somebody's being prosecuted for money laundering related to PDVSA, real estate is confiscated, yachts are confiscated, things like that. And they try and maybe put the two things together. But being able to listen to it as it's happening, I think, as you point out, for me, that's the most fascinating part, because you have a front row seat. It's as if you're in the movie theater watching one of these movies that we've all seen, but this is real life. And, you talk about tax havens. Well, some people would say we're sitting in the world's most important tax haven, being the United States, because of issues of transparency. So it opens, a little more of a window into the why and the how. And as you said, the enchufados, which I would probably say almost literal translation, right? These are people that are very plugged in, as we say in English, to the criminal element and how to manage their money. So just out of curiosity, so you have this, you conduct this investigation, you come up with this recording. Were you contacted by law enforcement from any of these countries that were interested in perhaps obtaining more information? Now, obviously, you're journalists, you protect your sources, etc. But do they reach out, or do they just conduct in parallel their own investigation and not involve you or try to gather your information?
So here in this case, really, the primary material came from law enforcement. So it was obtained, information was obtained from prosecutor office in Spain. We had access to, I think that something like 500 documents, different documents from the investigation that was ongoing. And in that sense, we had access to something that was being done by law enforcement already. And then we also interview them and the Spanish prosecutor to understand the context and the actuality, and if they are still prosecuting, what have been like the difficulties, etc., of that particular case. In parallel, we also have been like doing our investigation on our side. And of course, this is also a narrative podcast. So, as Laura was saying, we are trying to go to a broader audience and try to explain those very complicated schemes. First, the corruption scheme, which is very complex and was planned with these exchange rates in Venezuela that I don't know if maybe some people of the audience might remember, but at that time there was like an official exchange rate between Bolivar and USD and non-official one, and the difference was huge, so they were basically playing with that. So just trying to tell that part on a simple way. I don't know, we must have tried like 10, 15 times to script it, read it to our family, to our daughter, our grandmother, to see if they could understand basically. So we also had like a lot of interviews with different experts that could also simplify a bit and try to explain how it works. And we also complement this with some reporting in Miami. So we went to, for instance, the Porsche Tower, where some of the proceeds were invested. But also we try to explain why PDVSA is so important for Venezuela, what's the history of PDVSA from before the Chavez year, then the Chavez years, and how basically PDVSA has been in the center and still is. We can see it today with the US intervention. Oil is still at the center, at the very center of all the geopolitical things happening over there. So we really tried also to understand and investigate, but at the same time simplify and try to have enough voices, enough material to explain to people, and that was also the big effort, to go beyond investigation and also into a narrative podcast.
And also just very important for us in the podcast was to make it very, very, very clear that the corruption has victims. It's not a crime, because it's a white collar crime. So people tend to think, oh, well, because no one is dead, or, you don't see like a physical damage, you try to make it like relative, or undermine the pervasive effect that corruption could have on people. So in the fourth chapter, we interview 3 parents that lost their kids while they were protesting in Venezuela in 2017. And we decided to include them there with a very heartbreaking testimonies, really, really terrible, because part of the protest of their kids was against corruption. Like they went on the streets crying out for the government to really destine their resources to people instead of stealing it, basically. So in that sense, I also think that the podcast is a very, very important content in terms of understanding corruption as a whole phenomenon, that yes, it entails money, it entails crime, but it also have very human victims.
No, and that is an important point, because we see the criminals, we see the prosecutions, we see what it is they have stolen and where they have converted that, whether it's real estate or boats or planes or whatever that might be. But very little is talked about the impact it has on the population, because we're talking billions of dollars that, you're correct, should have been invested in infrastructure, in medicine, and in schools and education and things like that. And that is a great loss for the population of the country. And that was why, and I mentioned at the beginning that the heart of this sanctions program on Venezuela has been PDVSA, has been oil, because those are the most important proceeds that of public funds that are there, in theory, at the disposal of the public, the citizens. But unfortunately, that has not happened. And as you mentioned, yes, PDVSA, probably the largest oil reserves in the world are there. And we've seen the extension now, as you mentioned, after January 3rd. Now we've seen how oil is at the heart of everything that is now taking place in Venezuela. There is light. Well, there's some light at the end of this tunnel. We keep our fingers crossed that it continues in this direction. So this podcast, which, as I said, I mean, it's fascinating. And even before you get to the podcast, I would tell people, if you go to the website and see the way it's laid out, how it describes what is in the podcast, it's very well done. I congratulate you, because it pulls you in.
Thank you.
Because it really does highlight what you were saying. We're listening to corruption and money laundering while it's happening. It's not fictitious. It's not a movie. It's real life, and it really is incredible. So this focus obviously is Venezuela, Laura, for obvious reasons. Being Venezuelan and a journalist, it makes sense. Have you looked, and as you've tracked the movement of these corrupt funds, have you looked into what's going on in those various countries where this money has passed through? I mentioned earlier Panama, Miami, Spain, which are not the only countries, obviously, where this takes place. But you mentioned earlier how you'd obtain these documents from the prosecutor office in Madrid. Have you been able to do that outside of Venezuela in any of the other countries where the money might have flowed through? Because I know that's a challenge to get that type of information in many countries in Latin America.
I mean, Venezuela is probably the more difficult part when you are investigating, because it's totally untransparent. So even getting property records or company records is really complicated. So when investigating about Venezuela, we will tend to either rely on information from other places in the world that are a bit more transparent or very transparent, or also on leaks where we can have like some kind of information. So Venezuela, and there are some countries in Latin America that are even more difficult to investigate: Cuba, Nicaragua, and in general, some countries have been shutting down also, and there is this trend to be less transparent, which makes everything harder. But we've managed to track the funds, and for instance, in this case, the conversation, the funds go from Venezuela to New Zealand, then to Cyprus, then to the UK, and this part of the proceeds they were meant to be invested in Spain in this case. So it's very complex, and the conversation explains it very well. Why they want to choose Cyprus, because Cyprus is UE, although it's a bit flexible, but once it's in the UE, then it can go to the UK, and when it's in the UK, it's practically clean, and then they can put it in Spain. So these are the kind of discussion that are taking place in this audio, basically. And we try to track that down, also checking company records in different countries. We also have partners in those countries, so we can rely on local journalists that can also go to a registry, go knock a door, or talk with some source. So that's really why we work on a network and on a collaborative way to try to track down and identify these schemes that otherwise it would be impossible. And even for law enforcement, it's difficult to get information from other countries. So yeah, it's a big challenge.
And leads, because I think that's one of the key words for a journalist, right? Is I got a lead. I have a lead. Where, in cases like this, where do the leads originate?
It depends. In this case, it was a leak, but sometimes we have sources. Sometimes we are just browsing and we see a name that we don't recognize or seems familiar, but somehow it looks dodgy, or sometimes, as it happening, for example, right now in Venezuela, you see that a new whole process is opening, so you start to catch new names related to the government, for example. That's one of the cues that we could follow. Or sometimes we try to look for family members, or for girlfriends or boyfriends, or it really depends. It depends on the moment. It depends on also OCCRP has a huge amount of data that is available for journalists, different kind of leaks and information that put together could make sense. Otherwise, if you see it separately, it doesn't make sense. But when you put it together and you are able to somehow create relationships and establish patterns, that make our job easier. On the other hand, I think I will also like to mention that one of that might be interesting for your audience also is that what always they want to do is they want to go under the radar of the authorities. That's like the main objective, always. Yes, it is about moving money or laundering assets or whatever, but the silver lining in this conversation and in many conversations and in many of these schemes is just to go under the radar, to go undetected, and to create mechanisms that are strong enough that they could hide the money and never raise the red flags of the authorities. That's the main concern.
Yeah, I will add that we also make FOIA requests and we follow also some particular cases. We can get cases from docket, for instance. So sometimes a prosecutor is not so interested on a particular person because it's part of a bigger case, but for us it's important in another context. So basically, it's also a part of trying to find information there and check cases that are interesting and then get all the documents. And as Laura was saying, once we have a name of interest or company of interest, we will check it in our database. So we have a big database that is called Aleph. If you want, is a sort of Google of leaks and big databases. So we can cross-reference and check if a name is popping up elsewhere. And we also have a research team that works really as a due diligence team. Some of them come from a due diligence background because they can access to some tools that are the same ones as due diligence experts, as LexisNexis or commercial import-export databases, also databases about property, about companies, but also to track a plane, to track a ship or a yacht, different kind of tools. So this also helps us a lot to be able to round up a story, or within one lead, finding 5, 6, 7 other leads, and then becoming a bit crazy because you have too much information and you don't know what to do, but that's part of the game.
So following up on those last points, what would you say for our audience, particularly the compliance professionals, people responsible for due diligence, law enforcement responsible for conducting investigations? What would you say for them would be the key takeaways or the key learning moments from the investigation that they'll find in the podcast?
In terms of what, David? What will we say about what?
Well, in terms of this is the story of corruption. It's a story of money laundering and the people that are involved in it. So for compliance professionals on the one side,
Okay.
whose job is to, of course, know their customer, whose job is to understand activity that takes place that might lead them to feel there's something suspicious that should be looked at. Same thing with law enforcement, right? Law enforcement will see, because they also monitor activity in a different way, purchases of real estate, commercial shopping centers, etc. So from this investigation, from what they will see, what will they learn? What will they learn that will help them in their activities?
I don't know if they will learn something. I'm sure they could gather some ideas. Because it really depends on the institution or the person that is listening. But what I will say is that they most likely will get some different perspective on how things are done within the money laundering. That's for sure. Maybe listening the whole podcast, I think it could be of a very much value in terms on how to approach this information and make it more available. As Nathan was saying, one of the biggest challenges within the podcast was trying to explain money laundering to, to a wider audience. It was really like really, really challenging. And also, it's not just to explain the concept, but to create a product interesting enough that you get to the point where you are interested enough in listening on what is money laundering. So, because we understand that this whole thing might seem very complicated, I guess you and your audience are familiar enough with this reaction when you talk to people that is not familiar with this kind of things. Oh, that's very complicated, or I don't want to listen to it. It's very boring. That might be a likely reaction, right? And for example, and I guess it happens also to some people that are listening right now, some journalists risk their lives in order to publish this kind of articles, this kind of content. And this kind of content will only be listened by a few people that are able to relate with it. So I think one of the most important takeaways of the podcast is we present this whole information and this whole process in a way that was done on purpose to be, I don't know if entertaining, but at least relatable. And I think that part is very valuable for the people that work in our field, right?
Yeah, I would add, I mean, the scheme is quite sophisticated, and they talk a lot about not being detected, about KYC, about structures. So, and I would be very curious, and if Laura maybe can go to the conference you organized, to see if some of the listeners that are professionals would have detected it, for instance, because the whole conversation is how not to be detected. And like, of course, we are not finance professionals. We to understand it, it also costs us. And I would be very interested to have this conversation with someone that is from this world, and okay, could you get it, or do you think you wouldn't? And I think, I mean, and I would say also this also shows the, like due diligence and KYC is not, many times it's an invisible work that we don't realize many times why it's important. And I think that if it's well done, we can, and we can avoid this kind of, or make more difficult to corrupt persons, or to criminals, etc., to move their money. And I think that that's also interesting to understand, and I'm sure that people that work on that are conscious about that. But I think that you can also hear what is the impact of their own work, because it's always like trying to play cat and mouse, and here they are trying to get away with it. So I would be interested to know that as a takeaway a bit from this audience, basically.
Well, that's a great point. And I think one of the things they will tell you, and that this will prove to the world, is how difficult and how challenging the job is for those people to detect these schemes. Because as you mentioned, Venezuela, New Zealand, Spain. This money is moving to so many different points that when it gets to the end point, how are they supposed to know that all of that went on before it arrived there? And that is the challenge for the compliance professional. And I think that will be one of the things they will definitely have as a takeaway and say, you see, these people are scheming and plotting all day to avoid our controls. And that's why it's so difficult for us. So on that note, I'm going to leave it there. Laura, Nathan, thank you again for your time and sharing your perspectives with us. For the audience, as I said, it's OCCRP. If you go there, you will find the link to the podcast. And I really recommend it to you because, as you just heard, it's a scheme being plotted, being acted out in real time, and will give you an idea of why your job is so challenging and what it is that you have to look out for. And you can hear more about these schemes, Venezuela, sanctions, at our 26th annual AML Compliance Conference, which will take place March 23rd through the 26th at the Intercontinental Hotel in downtown Miami. From what you've just heard, we'll have stories like that. You do not want to miss it. So we will see you all there. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for the invitation. And yeah, you can find the podcast Cuellos Blancos, Manos Sucias in Spotify, in Spanish, in Apple Podcast. We also upload it in YouTube. And we did an AI translation in English. It's not as good, but it was a bit of an experiment that you can also find in our webpage in OCCRP. So feel free to hear it in Spanish, in English, and to share it, of course. Thank you.